For nearly a century, there was one golden rule in the sky. If it ain't Boeing, I ain't going. To step onto a Boeing jetliner was to trust your life to the absolute pinnacle of human engineering. This was a company built by obsessive, pocket protector-wearing aerospace engineers who answered to the laws of physics, not the demands of Wall Street. They were the architects of the B-17 Flying Fortress that helped win World War II. They were the pioneers who shrank the globe with the 707, and they were the visionaries who built the 747 jumbo jet, a plane so massive and so ambitious, it nearly bankrupted the entire company just to get it off the drawing board. But Boeing didn't care about the money. They cared about building the perfect flying machine, until they didn't. What happens when the people designing your airplanes stop looking at wind tunnels and start looking at stock tickers? What happens when a culture of relentless safety is hijacked by a culture of ruthless cost-cutting? You get the Boeing 737 MAX, an airplane that was never supposed to exist, an airplane that was hastily cobbled together in a boardroom out of sheer corporate terror, pushed through a compromised regulatory system and sold with a deadly hidden secret. A secret that would violently force two brand new jets out of the sky, slaughtering 346 innocent people and exposing the most catastrophic corporate cover-up in modern industrial history. This is not a story about a mechanical failure. This is the story of how corporate greed murdered the greatest aviation company on Earth. To understand how Boeing built a machine that actively fought its own pilots until they crashed, you have to understand the hostile takeover that destroyed the company's soul. In 1997, Boeing merged with its struggling rival, McDonnell Douglas. To the outside world, it looked like Boeing was swallowing a weaker competitor. But inside the company, the engineers joked that McDonnell Douglas had bought Boeing with Boeing's own money. The executives from McDonnell Douglas were notorious penny pinchers. They didn't care about pushing the boundaries of aerospace engineering. They cared about maximizing shareholder value. They stripped the engineers of their power and handed the keys to the kingdom to the accountants. The corporate headquarters was ripped out of Seattle, away from the factories and the grease and the riveting guns, and moved to a sterile skyscraper in Chicago, specifically so the executives wouldn't have to listen to the complaints of their own builders. For a decade, this new cutthroat strategy worked. Boeing's stock price skyrocketed. The executives paid themselves tens of millions of dollars in bonuses, and Wall Street applauded. But while the accountants were busy counting their cash, they completely ignored the massive European threat building right across the Atlantic: Airbus. For years, Airbus had been a thorn in Boeing's side, but in 2010, they dropped an absolute nuclear bomb on the aviation industry. They announced the A320neo. NEO stood for New Engine Option. Airbus had taken their flagship short-haul jet and strapped massive, ultra-efficient LEAP engines onto the wings. This new plane would burn 15% less fuel than anything else in the sky. In the airline business, fuel is the ultimate expense. A 15% reduction in fuel burn is not just an upgrade, it is an apocalyptic threat to the competition. Airlines went absolutely berserk. The orders for the A320neo flooded in so fast that Airbus couldn't build factories quickly enough. And then, the unthinkable happened. American Airlines, Boeing's most loyal, exclusive customer for over a decade, called Chicago and delivered a terrifying ultimatum. American told Boeing that they were about to buy hundreds of Airbus jets, unless Boeing could magically produce a plane that matched the fuel efficiency of the A320neo. Boeing was caught completely off guard. They had been resting on their laurels, squeezing profit out of decades-old designs. To build a brand-new clean-sheet airplane to compete with the A320neo would take 10 years and cost upwards of $15 billion. They didn't have 10 years. They had days. Driven by sheer corporate panic and the terrifying prospect of losing their dominance, The executives made a desperate, fateful decision. They would not spend the time or the money to build a new, safe airplane. Instead, they were going to take the Boeing 737, a plane designed in the 1960s, a plane that was never built to hold modern, massive engines, and they were going to duct tape it into the 21st century. They called it the 737 MAX. It was meant to be the savior of Boeing's stock price. Instead, it would become a flying Frankenstein. And to get it certified, Boeing was about to make a deal with the devil. The Boeing 737 was a masterpiece of 1960s engineering. It was designed in an era before airport jet bridges even existed, so the engineers built it incredibly low to the ground. This allowed ground crews to load baggage by hand and mechanics to service the engines without needing tall ladders. For 40 years, that low-to-the-ground stance was the 737's greatest advantage, until Boeing needed to strap massive, modern LEAP engines onto it. The new engines that Boeing needed to compete with Airbus were physically too large to fit under the wings of the 737. If you just bolted them on, they would literally scrape against the runway. From a pure engineering standpoint, the solution was obvious: build a taller landing gear or design a brand new airplane. But the executives in Chicago refused. Designing a new landing gear would change the structural geometry of the plane, and building a new plane would take 10 years. Boeing was hemorrhaging billions of dollars to Airbus by the day. They needed a cheap, fast shortcut. So they told their engineers to simply shove the massive new engines further forward and mount them higher up, practically resting them on top of the wings. It looked absurd, but it worked. The engines cleared the ground. Boeing celebrated, Wall Street rejoiced, and the orders for the new 737 MAX started rolling in. But there was a terrifying problem that Boeing was desperately trying to hide. By moving those massive, powerful engines forward and upward, they had completely destroyed the aerodynamic balance of the airplane. In a wind tunnel, engines act like giant sails. When the 737 MAX was flying at a high angle of attack, like during a steep climb after takeoff, the massive engine casings would catch the wind and aggressively push the nose of the plane even further up. If the nose of an airplane pitches up too high, the wings lose their lift. The plane stalls, and it drops out of the sky like a rock. Boeing test pilots discovered this fatal flaw in the flight simulators. The 737 MAX was inherently aerodynamically unstable. Normally, fixing an aerodynamic flaw requires reshaping the wings or the tail, but any physical changes to the airframe would trigger a devastating chain reaction with the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA. You see, Boeing's entire sales pitch to airlines was that the 737 MAX was exactly the same as the old 737s. That meant airlines wouldn't have to spend millions of dollars sending their pilots to expensive flight simulators to learn how to fly a new plane. In fact, Boeing was so desperate to beat Airbus that they made a contractual promise to Southwest Airlines. If the FAA ever decides that pilots need simulator training to fly the MAX, Boeing will personally pay Southwest a penalty of $1 million per airplane. With hundreds of planes on order, a mandate for simulator training would instantly cost Boeing hundreds of millions of dollars. To save their profit margins, the executives demanded a software fix. Instead of fixing the aerodynamics of the plane, Boeing's software engineers wrote a secret line of code into the flight computer. They called it the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS. MCAS was designed to act as an invisible hand. If the plane's sensors detected that the nose was pitching up too high, MCAS would automatically turn a massive jack screw in the tail, forcefully pushing the nose back down. The pilots wouldn't even know it was happening. The plane would feel exactly like an old 737, the airlines wouldn't have to pay for simulator training, and Boeing would save billions. But in their frantic rush to get the plane certified, Boeing broke the most sacred rule of aviation engineering: redundancy. In a commercial airliner, everything has a backup. If one computer fails, a second one takes over. But incredibly, Boeing wired the MCAS software to rely on the data from a single angle of attack sensor, a fragile, tiny metal weather vane mounted on the outside of the fuselage. If a bird hit that sensor, or if it froze over with ice, it could trick the computer into thinking the plane was pitching up, even if it was flying perfectly level. And if that happened, MCAS would activate, and the computer would aggressively force the nose of the plane down into a fatal dive. Boeing engineers knew exactly how dangerous this was, but the corporate culture of intimidation was so strong that nobody spoke up. The FAA, crippled by budget cuts and essentially allowing Boeing to regulate itself, rubber-stamped the airplane. And then, Boeing did the unthinkable. To guarantee that the airlines wouldn't have to pay for simulator training, Boeing completely deleted any mention of MCAS from the pilot flight manuals. Thousands of pilots around the world were about to step into the cockpit of the 737 MAX, completely unaware that a secret, lethal piece of software was lurking in the background, waiting for a single sensor to fail. The trap was set, and it was about to snap shut. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta into a clear blue sky. On board were 189 passengers and crew, flying on a brand new Boeing 737 MAX that had been delivered just 2 months prior. Almost immediately after takeoff, something went catastrophically wrong. A single, fragile angle of attack sensor on the outside of the plane had malfunctioned. It began sending faulty data to the flight computer, telling it that the nose of the plane was pitched up dangerously high even though the jet was climbing normally. Deep inside the computer, the secret MCAS software woke up. Thinking the plane was about to stall, MCAS forcefully rolled the massive jack screw in the tail, aggressively pushing the nose of the plane down. The pilots were thrown forward against their harnesses. They had absolutely no idea what was happening. They pulled back on their control yokes with all their strength to bring the nose back up. For a few seconds, it worked. But MCAS was programmed to be relentless. 10 seconds later, it triggered again, forcing the nose down even harder. A horrifying tug-of-war began, the pilots against the machine. For 12 agonizing minutes, the crew fought to save the plane. They pulled back on the controls. MCAS pushed forward. They pulled back. MCAS pushed forward. Over and over, 21 separate times, the secret software overrode the human pilots. The pilots frantically searched their manuals, looking for a way to stop the plane from diving. But they found nothing, because Boeing had deliberately deleted MCAS from the manuals to save money on training. They were fighting a ghost in the machine, and the ghost won. Lion Air Flight 610 slammed into the Java Sea at nearly 500 miles per hour, instantly killing all 189 people on board. In the aftermath, the aviation world was stunned. A brand new Boeing airplane had literally flown itself into the ocean. When the black boxes were recovered, the horrifying truth about MCAS was finally exposed to the world. You would think that after discovering a secret lethal software flaw that just killed 189 people, Boeing would instantly ground the entire 737 MAX fleet. But they didn't. Instead, Boeing's executives went on the defensive. They blamed the dead Indonesian pilots, claiming they just didn't have the flying skills of American aviators. Boeing issued a minor bulletin telling pilots how to turn off the trim system in an emergency and promised they would roll out a software patch in a few weeks. The FAA, shockingly, agreed with Boeing. They allowed the 737 MAX to keep flying, carrying millions of unsuspecting passengers every single day. It was a gamble driven entirely by arrogance and greed. And 5 months later, they lost that gamble. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 took off from Addis Ababa. Just like Lion Air, a single angle of attack sensor failed. Just like Lion Air, MCAS activated. But this time, the pilots knew about MCAS. They had read the Boeing bulletin. When the plane started pitching down, they immediately hit the cutoff switches to disable the electrical trim system, exactly as Boeing had instructed. But it was too late. Because of the extreme aerodynamic forces on the tail, the pilots were physically incapable of turning the manual trim wheel by hand. The plane was locked in a dive. In a desperate final attempt to save the 157 people on board, they turned the electricity back on to use the electric thumb switches. The moment the electricity flowed back into the computer, MCAS woke up one final time and issued a massive, unrecoverable nose-down command. 6 minutes after takeoff, Flight 302 buried itself into the Earth at 700 miles per hour. Another 157 innocent people were dead. The blood was entirely on Boeing's hands. Within days, aviation authorities around the world rebelled against the FAA and unilaterally grounded the 737 MAX. It was the longest and most humiliating grounding of an airliner in aviation history. The Boeing 737 MAX crisis was not a failure of engineering, it was a failure of corporate morality. The executives who designed a system where a single sensor failure could doom an airliner didn't do it because they didn't know better. They did it because building a safe airplane would have hurt the quarterly profits. They gambled 346 lives against the stock price. The engineers at Boeing used to build airplanes that changed the world. But when the accountants took over, they built a machine that destroyed the greatest aviation legacy on Earth.